He told the board I was just a mid-level operations manager. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had been quietly buying shares of this company for 25 years, and I owned more of it than his mother ever did. The conference room smelled like fresh paint and stale coffee. They had just renovated it, new glass panels, polished oak table leather chairs that looked expensive but felt cold. Everything about the room tried too hard to impress. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the table, scrolling through his presentation like he was performing confidence instead of feeling it. He was 29, freshly minted with a business degree and a title no one had officially approved: Chief Transformation Officer. His mother, Eleanor Caldwell, was the chairwoman. That explained everything. 8 people sat around the table. No one spoke. No one challenged him. And me, I sat at the far end, hands folded, quiet. "Ruby," he said, not even looking at me. "Effective immediately, your role is being restructured." Restructured. That word always sounds cleaner than what it really means. You'll be transitioning from director of operations to floor supervisor. Your compensation will be adjusted to reflect the new scope. Adjusted. From $280,000 down to $165,000. A 40% cut. Just like that. He clicked to the next slide, already moving on like my entire career was just another bullet point. I nodded once. "I understand," I said. 2 words. He finally glanced at me just for a second, then looked back at his screen. He mistook my calm for acceptance. People usually do. Before we go any further, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you find this story resonates with you. And let me know where you started listening and what time it is right now. I'm happy to connect with listeners from all over the world. Let me introduce myself a little. My name is Ruby Dean. I'm 55 years old. I've spent the last 25 years at Iron Vale Industrial Systems. I started on the production floor when I was 30, steel-toe boots, 12-hour shifts, learning machines by sound before I ever learned them by name. I worked my way up the only way that actually counts: results. No shortcuts, no politics, no last names opening doors. Just output. Every year followed the same rhythm: do the work, ignore the noise, collect the bonus, and quietly buy more stock. That last part mattered more than anyone realized. Ethan kept talking. Slides, projections, restructuring phases. I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching. Watching a room that didn't realize it had already made a mistake it couldn't undo. I've seen that look before. Years ago, in a different life, in situations where everything seemed under control right before it wasn't. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct him. Because sometimes, the most powerful move you can make is to let someone finish digging their own hole. What follows contains fictional elements and is AI-assisted to highlight the humanistic message and emotional experience. Hopefully, you'll find something for yourself. If not, take good care of yourself, and we'll see each other again later. I had been working at Iron Vale Industrial Systems for 25 years, long enough to know every machine by sound, long enough to recognize a problem before it showed up on a report, long enough to understand that most people don't really see what's right in front of them. I walked into this company at 30, straight out of a life that taught me how pressure works. Not theoretical pressure, real pressure, the kind that builds quietly, holds for a while, and then breaks everything if you misread it. Iron Vale made sense to me from the beginning. Metal behaves honestly. Systems follow patterns. If something fails, there's always a reason. You just have to look close enough. I started on the production floor. 12-hour shifts, heat, noise, repetition. The kind of work that filters people out fast. Some left within weeks. Some stayed but never really learned. I paid attention. At first, it was the basics. Processes, timing, tolerances. Then it became something deeper. The way a system sounded when it was running slightly off. The way a material changed color before it failed inspection. Small things most people ignored. Those small things matter. Within 2 years, I was supervising. Within 5, managing entire sections. Promotions came, but not because I chased them. They came because the numbers made it difficult to pass me over. Every role I stepped into, I left better than I found it. Output increased. Waste decreased. Downtime dropped. Not dramatically at first, incrementally, consistently. That's how real improvement works. There was no shortcut to it. No presentation slides, no polished language. Just work. I wasn't the loudest person in the room. I didn't argue in meetings or compete for attention. I let other people do that. It kept things simple. People assumed silence meant limitation. They were wrong. Over time, I moved into operations leadership, director level, responsibility for systems that affected the entire company, decisions that actually mattered. But my routine never changed. Show up, do the work, fix what's broken, improve what works, repeat. That kind of consistency doesn't stand out day to day, but over years, it builds something most people don't understand until it's too late. Trust, reputation, and leverage. By the time Ethan Caldwell walked into that conference room and decided to reduce my role to a line item, I had already spent a quarter of a century learning every inch of that company, every process, every weakness, every assumption people stopped questioning. I sat there and listened because I could, not because I had to. Because when you've built something patiently for that long, you don't rush the moment when everything finally shifts. What most people never understood about my career at Ironvale wasn't the promotions. It was what I did with what those promotions gave me. There was a routine I followed every year and I never broke it. Do the work. Stay out of politics. Collect the bonus. And then, buy the stock. That last part started small. In my first year, Ironvale offered an employee stock purchase plan. 15% discount on shares if you reinvested your bonus. Most people treated it like a side option, something nice to have if there was money left over. There usually wasn't. I made sure there always was. I remember the first time I chose stock over cash. It wasn't a dramatic decision. No big realization. Just a quiet choice that felt correct. I took the shares. The next quarter, I did it again. And the quarter after that. There's something most people don't appreciate about repetition. It doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It feels ordinary, almost invisible. But repetition is where things start to compound. Years passed and nothing about the pattern changed. I didn't increase my lifestyle when my salary grew. I didn't celebrate bonuses with purchases that disappeared a year later. I converted them into something that stayed. Shares. At first, the numbers were small enough to ignore, fractions of a percent. Numbers that didn't show up in conversations, numbers no one tracked closely. But I tracked them. Every purchase, every increase, every shift, quietly. By my 5th year, the position had grown enough to be noticeable on paper but still not interesting enough for anyone to question. By my 10th year, it had become something else entirely. Not control, not yet, but influence. The kind that sits just below visibility. That's where things get interesting. Because once you reach that level, opportunities start to appear. Not obvious ones, subtle ones. A retiring executive who wants liquidity. A senior manager cashing out to fund something outside the company. Small blocks of shares changing hands without much attention. Most buyers in those situations think short-term. They negotiate aggressively, push for advantage, try to squeeze every dollar. I didn't. I offered clarity, clean transactions, no complications, no delays. I wasn't trying to win the negotiation. I was trying to complete it. And that difference mattered. Over time, people started coming to me directly, quiet conversations, private agreements, Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise concern. Just business. Every transfer documented. Every requirement followed. Everything filed exactly the way it needed to be. There's a discipline to doing things properly over a long period of time. It builds something stronger than speed ever could. Credibility. And credibility makes things easier, faster, smoother. By the time I crossed into my 15th year, the pattern had become a system, not complicated, just consistent. Stock purchases through the plan, private acquisitions when opportunities appeared, reinvestment of everything that came back, again and again. Year after year. No announcements, no attention. Because attention changes how people behave, and I needed them to behave exactly the way they always had. Unaware. By the time Ethan Caldwell decided to redefine my role in that conference room, he thought he was dealing with an employee. Someone whose value could be adjusted, reduced, reassigned. What he didn't understand was that while he was measuring authority in titles, I had been measuring it in ownership. And those two things don't operate on the same level. Ownership alone isn't enough. If you want to build something that lasts, you have to protect it. That realization came early. Around my second year at Ironvale, I reconnected with someone I hadn't seen in a long time, Daniel Hayes. We had served together years before in a different environment where mistakes had consequences you couldn't undo. After leaving that life, he went into law. Corporate securities, shareholder rights. The kind of work that deals with power most people don't realize exists. He was the only person I trusted with what I was doing. We met in a small diner outside the city. Nothing special. Coffee, a legal pad, and a conversation that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Don't hold it in your name, he told me. Build a structure. Something that can carry the weight when it matters. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. He explained it patiently. A trust. Not for hiding anything, for organizing it. Separating ownership from visibility. Creating a framework where every acquisition, every percentage increase, every transaction would be recorded, protected, and legally reinforced. We set it up within months. Dean Holdings Trust. It wasn't complicated on the surface, but underneath it was precise. Every share I acquired went through that structure. Every filing was submitted exactly as required. Every threshold disclosure was handled the moment it was triggered. 5%, 10%, 20%. Each step documented, publicly available, completely transparent, and completely ignored. That's the part that always surprises people. They assume something like this has to be hidden. It doesn't. It just has to be overlooked. And most people don't look. Boards rely on summaries. Executives rely on assumptions. As long as nothing forces them to dig deeper, they don't. Daniel made sure of one thing above all else. There would never be a mistake. Every filing cross-checked, every timeline verified, every document built to hold up under scrutiny from anyone who cared enough to question it. For years, no one did. The information sat where it always had been. Accessible, accurate, unnoticed. As my ownership grew, so did the strength of that structure. It wasn't just about how many shares I held anymore. It was about how those shares were positioned. Legally, strategically, in a way that created options. One conversation with Daniel stands out more than the rest. It was about 8 years ago. Same diner. Same kind of quiet afternoon where nothing seems urgent. He slid a printed document across the table. Article 9, he said. Corporate Governance Clause, Emergency Shareholder Authority. I read it once. Then again. If a majority shareholder was affected by unilateral executive action without proper authorization, that shareholder had the right to call an emergency board session within a fixed time frame, mandatory attendance, full review, no delays. This is your insurance, Daniel said. You'll probably never need it. I folded the paper and put it away. But I didn't forget it. Because structures like that don't exist for everyday situations. They exist for moments when someone makes a decision they don't fully understand. Decisions based on incomplete information. Or worse, assumptions. By the time Ethan Caldwell stood in that conference room and decided to restructure my role, everything he needed to know had already been documented for years. He just never thought to look. And that's what made what happened next inevitable. By the time that meeting ended, the decision had already been made. Not by Ethan, by me. I didn't argue with him. I didn't correct him in front of the board. I didn't point out the gaps in his authority or the assumptions he was making. There's no value in interrupting someone who hasn't finished revealing how little they understand. I stood up, gathered my folder, and walked out of the room without saying another word. No one stopped me. No one asked a question. The hallway outside felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that follows something people don't fully process yet. I took the elevator down to the parking garage. Same concrete, same hum of fluorescent lights, same faint smell of oil that had been there for decades. Nothing about the building had changed, but something had shifted. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, not thinking, not reacting, just measuring. There's a point in every situation where it stops being about what just happened and starts being about what comes next. This was that point. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't needed to call in a long time. Daniel Hayes. He picked up on the second ring. I was wondering how long it would take, he said. No greeting, no small talk. He already knew. Walk me through it, he continued. So I did. The meeting, the presentation, the demotion, the salary cut, the title Ethan gave himself without board approval, the fact that no legal review had been done before the decision. I kept it simple, exact, no emotion. When I finished, there was a brief pause. Then I heard the sound of a pen clicking. His title, Daniel said, was it formally ratified by the board? No. You're certain? I've reviewed every resolution for years. It doesn't exist. Another short pause, and he took unilateral action affecting your compensation and role. Without your written consent? Yes. That was all he needed. Then the clause applies, he said. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just confirmation. I leaned back in the seat, looking up at the concrete ceiling of the garage. How long? I asked. I'll file within the hour, he replied. Once it's submitted, the board is legally required to convene within 36 hours. 36 hours. That's all it would take. A decision made casually in a conference room would now be reviewed under full scrutiny by people who hadn't looked closely enough for years. That puts us at Thursday morning, he continued. If they move quickly, they would. Because once the filing was seen by the right person, everything would accelerate. Do it, I said. It's already in motion. The call ended. I didn't call anyone else. Not Ethan. Not Eleanor Caldwell. Not anyone in the company. There was nothing to say. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a process. And processes, when built correctly, don't rely on emotion. They rely on structure. I started the engine and drove home. That night, I didn't review documents. I didn't prepare statements. I didn't rehearse anything. I followed my normal routine. Because there's no need to rush when everything is already moving exactly the way it should. What happened next wouldn't depend on what I said. It would depend on what had already been written, filed, and waiting to be read. If you think I acted correctly by staying calm, saying nothing, and letting the law handle things instead of reacting emotionally, then please leave a 1 in the comments. I didn't check my phone again that night. After the call with Daniel, everything that needed to be done was already in motion. There was no advantage in hovering over it, no benefit in reacting early. So I went home. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in when routine replaces noise. I fed the dog, poured a drink I'd been saving, and sat outside for a while looking out toward the industrial district, where Iron Vale's lights still burned in the distance. From where I sat, I could see the upper floors of the building, the executive offices, the space Ethan had taken over months ago. The lights were still on. Good. Let him enjoy it. At 6:42 p.m., Daniel sent a message. Filed. That was it. No explanation. No extra detail. Just confirmation that the clock had started. I went to bed not long after and slept better than I had in weeks. While I slept, things began to move. The filing landed in the inbox of Iron Vale's corporate secretary, Linda Carver. She'd held that position for over a decade. Careful, methodical, the kind of person who didn't ignore unusual documents. She opened it later that evening. Read it once. Then again. And then she picked up the phone. The first call went to Martin Blake, the company's general counsel. He didn't answer. It was late and he was out. She left a message. Short. Direct. Martin, we've received an emergency shareholder filing. You need to review this tonight. He listened to it just before 10. Called her back immediately. Who filed it? He asked. An entity called Dean Holdings Trust, she said. It claims majority ownership. There was a pause on the line. Dean. As in, Ruby Dean. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Martin had been with the company for 8 years. He was thorough, careful. And unlike some others, he didn't rely on assumptions when something didn't make sense. He went straight to the source, opened the SEC database, pulled the filings, and started reading. The most recent disclosure came up first, then the previous one, then the one before that. A pattern, consistent, documented, unbroken. He kept going. Years of filings, share acquisitions, transfers, quarterly purchases. Every threshold crossed and reported exactly when it should have been. Everything clean, everything precise, everything real. By the time he reached the older documents, the picture was clear. This wasn't a recent development. It had been building for decades. He printed the records, page after page, a full stack of documentation that told a story no one in leadership had bothered to read. Later, he would say his hands started to tighten around page 10. By page 20, he had stopped leaning back in his chair. By the time he finished, he wasn't moving at all. Because the conclusion wasn't complicated. The person who had just been demoted earlier that day was the majority owner of the company. And the action taken against her hadn't just been aggressive, it had been unauthorized. That distinction mattered. A lot. At 10:58 p.m., Martin made his next call. Not to Ethan, to Eleanor Caldwell. She answered after a few rings, her voice controlled, measured. Martin, it's late. I need you in the office first thing in the morning, he said. There's something you need to see. What is this about? He didn't soften it. Ruby Dean owns the company. Silence. Not confusion. Not denial. Just silence. Because some statements don't leave room for interpretation, they've filed under an emergency governance clause. He continued. We are required to convene the board within 36 hours. Another pause. This one heavier. That's not possible, she said finally. It is, Martin replied. And it's documented. What happened next wouldn't be managed quietly. It couldn't be. Because once something like this is formally recognized, it stops being internal. It becomes unavoidable. And by morning, everyone who needed to know would know. Morning came like any other. No urgency, no chaos. Just the same routine I'd followed for years. I woke up early, made coffee, fed the dog, and stepped outside for a few minutes before the day started. The air was cool, quiet, steady. The kind of morning that doesn't hint at what's already unfolding behind closed doors. My phone was on the kitchen counter. I hadn't touched it since the night before. When I finally picked it up, the screen told me everything I needed to know. Missed calls. More than a dozen. Some from numbers I recognized. Some I didn't. A few from Martin Blake. Several from Eleanor Caldwell's office. And 5 from Ethan. I didn't return a single one. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and sat down at the table like nothing had changed. Because for me, nothing had. The process was already running. And processes don't speed up just because someone gets nervous. A message came in a few minutes later from someone inside the building. Karen Holt, operations coordinator. She'd been there long enough to understand when something unusual was happening. Something's off, she wrote. Martin was here before 6 a.m. Eleanor showed up right after. Executive floor is locked down. Conference room B is being prepped like it's a full board session. I read it once, typed back 3 words. Understood. Thank you. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Board meeting confirmed. Tomorrow morning. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Everything was lining up exactly the way it should. By that point, the information had already moved through the right channels. The filing had been read, the implications understood, and the people responsible for managing it were now dealing with something they couldn't ignore. That's when urgency starts, not when something happens, when it's finally recognized. Around 8:15 a.m., Ethan called again. I watched his name light up on the screen for a few seconds, then let it fade. Whatever he wanted to say now didn't matter, because the conversation he should have had was the one he skipped before making his decision. I went about my day the same way I always did. Fixed a hinge on the back gate that had been sticking for weeks. Drove into town. Had lunch at a place I'd been going to for years. Sat by the window. Ate slowly. No rush. No distractions. Because there's a kind of clarity that comes when you know exactly how something is going to unfold. You don't need to chase updates. You don't need to react. You just let it happen. In the early afternoon, Daniel called. Board is confirmed, he said. All members notified. Full attendance. Good, I replied. They've seen everything he added. Every filing. Every percentage. Every transfer. Of course they had. Once something like that lands on the right desk, it doesn't stay unread. What's the mood, I asked. A brief pause. Not good for them, he said. Controlled, but tense. There are questions about how this was missed for so long. That part didn't surprise me. When information is available but ignored, people don't question the data. They question themselves. And Ethan, I asked. He doesn't know yet, Daniel said. Not fully. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. He will. There was a moment of silence on the line. Then Daniel spoke again, quieter this time. Tomorrow changes things. I looked out the window, watching the light shift across the yard. It already has, I said. Because the truth is, the moment that filing went through, the outcome stopped being uncertain. All that was left now was for everyone else to catch up. Thursday morning arrived without ceremony. No announcements, no warnings. Just a time and a place that had already been set in motion. I got dressed with the same precision I applied to everything else. Dark suit, clean lines, no excess. I chose it years ago for moments that required clarity, not performance. Before leaving, I paused for a second in front of the mirror. Not to adjust anything, just to confirm what I already knew. This wasn't about proving something. It was about confirming it. I drove to Ironvale and parked in the main lot, the same one I had used for 25 years. Not the executive garage, not the reserved spaces, the same place I'd always been. Some habits don't change just because your position does. The building looked exactly as it always had. Glass steel and the quiet weight of something that had been running long before most people inside it arrived. I walked through the front entrance at 9:38 a.m. The security guard at the desk, Frank Delaney, looked up as I approached. He'd been there for years, reliable, observant. For the first time since I'd known him, he stood up. Morning, Ms. Dean. Morning, Frank. He didn't say anything else, but the way he nodded told me everything I needed to know. People had started to understand. Daniel was waiting outside Conference Room B on the third floor. Same calm expression, same steady posture. He carried a leather briefcase that looked older than most of the people in the executive wing. "You're early," he said. "I prefer it that way." He gave a small nod. "So do I." We walked in together. The room was different from the one earlier that week, but the structure was the same. Long table, leather chairs, controlled lighting, everything designed to project authority. Today, it actually held it. All 9 board members were already seated, every chair filled, every face focused. Martin Blake sat to the left with a stack of documents in front of him, thick enough to carry weight without explanation. Linda Carver sat just behind legal pad, ready, expression tight. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Caldwell, composed, still. But there was something different in her posture, less certainty, more awareness. And at the far end of the table, there was an empty chair. In front of it, a nameplate, Dean Holdings Trust Majority Shareholder. Daniel placed his briefcase beside it and stepped back. I took the seat. No one spoke. No one needed to. The clock on the wall read 9:57 a.m. 3 minutes passed without movement. Then, at exactly 10 a.m., the door opened. Ethan walked in. Same confidence, same pace, same assumption that he understood the room he was entering. He didn't. His eyes moved across the table, the board, the documents. Daniel, then me, and finally, the nameplate. He stopped, just for a fraction of a second. "Mom," he said, looking toward Eleanor. "What is this?" She didn't look at him. "Sit down, Ethan." He hesitated, adjusted his tie. "I wasn't informed of a board session," he said. "If this is about the restructuring rollout, I can sit down." This time, there was no room for interpretation. He sat, slowly. Martin stood. No introductions, no delays. "This emergency session has been convened under Article 9 of the Corporate Charter," he said. The filing was submitted Tuesday evening by Dean Holdings Trust on behalf of its sole beneficiary. He paused, looked directly at Ethan. "Ruby Dean." The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that waits. The kind that confirms. Dean Holdings Trust holds 62% of Ironvale Industrial Systems issued shares, Martin continued. This position has been documented through continuous regulatory filings over the past 25 years. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Because in that moment, everything he thought he knew about authority stopped applying. Martin didn't rush. He didn't need to. Everything he was about to say was already backed by documentation sitting right in front of every person in that room. Every acquisition, every transfer, every threshold disclosure has been properly filed and publicly available, he continued. Form 4 filings, Schedule 13D amendments, quarterly stock purchases through the employee plan, private transactions with former executives. He lifted a sheet from the stack and held it just high enough for the table to see. At the current valuation of Ironvale Industrial Systems, Ms. Dean's 62% stake represents approximately $1.3 billion. No one reacted outwardly, but I saw it. A shift in posture, a tightening of expressions, the quiet recalibration that happens when assumptions collapse. Ethan finally looked at me, not past me, at me. For the first time since we'd ever been in the same room, he wasn't performing. "That's not..." he started, then stopped. Because there wasn't a version of that sentence that would hold up. Daniel spoke from behind me, calm and measured. "It's accurate," he said. "Every filing is verifiable, every percentage traceable. There are no gaps." Ethan turned toward his mother. Mom Eleanor didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the documents in front of her. Martin continued. There is an additional issue, he said. The title of Chief Transformation Officer, under which Mr. Caldwell executed the restructuring decision, was never formally ratified by a full board resolution. A few heads at the table shifted slightly. Not surprised. Confirmed. It was created through internal memo, Martin added, without formal vote, without recorded approval. That mattered, because authority without validation isn't authority, it's assumption. And as a result, Martin said any unilateral action taken under that title affecting compensation role or employment status is legally questionable. Ethan's hands were flat on the table now. Still. Completely still. This is a misunderstanding, he said, his voice tighter than before. We can resolve this internally. A governance review may be a Ethan. Eleanor's voice cut through the room. Not loud, but final. He stopped. Martin didn't look at him again. A motion has been submitted by the majority shareholder, he said, to reverse all restructuring actions taken under the unratified title and to remove Mr. Caldwell from his position effective immediately. No build-up, no dramatics, just a statement. Then he began calling the vote, one by one, name after name. Each director answered clearly. Yes. No hesitation, no debate, just confirmation. Around the table it went, until only one voice remained. Eleanor Caldwell. She lifted her head slowly, looked at her son, really looked at him. For a moment there was something there that didn't belong in a boardroom. Then it was gone. Yes, she said. 9 votes. Unanimous. The decision settled into the room without noise. Martin closed the folder in front of him. The motion carries, he said. Mr. Caldwell, your position is terminated effective immediately. Ethan stood up so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the cabinet behind him. He looked at me again. Different this time. Not confusion, not confidence. Something closer to realization. You knew, he said. I met his eyes. I understood, I replied. There's a difference. He stood there for a second longer as if trying to find something to hold on to. There wasn't anything left. Because by the time a decision reaches that point, it's already over. The door opened behind him. Security stepped in. Professional, quiet. He didn't argue. Didn't say anything else. He just walked out. And when the door closed, the room didn't feel the same anymore. Because now it finally reflected reality. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds after the door closed. Not out of shock, out of adjustment. Because when something shifts that completely, people need a moment to realign with the new structure. Martin was the first to speak again. We'll proceed with the remaining agenda, he said, his tone returning to professional neutrality. Next item concerns interim executive leadership. No one questioned it. There was no discussion about whether change was necessary. That part had already been decided. A motion has been submitted. He continued to appoint Ms. Ruby Dean as interim chief executive officer effective immediately pending formal confirmation within 30 days. No surprise there, not anymore. He looked around the table. Any objections? There were none. The vote was quicker this time, unanimous again. Just like before. Motion carries, Martin said. And just like that, the structure of the company changed. Not gradually, not over time, instantly. My compensation was restored to its original level, then adjusted upward to reflect the new role. Details would be finalized later, but the direction was clear. Authority had shifted, backed by ownership, backed by process, backed by documentation that had been sitting in plain sight for years. The rest of the meeting continued for another hour. Governance reviews, legal exposure, internal communication strategy, steps to stabilize operations and reassure stakeholders. All necessary, all expected. I listened, contributed when it mattered, ignored what didn't, because most of it was just cleanup. The real decision had already been made. When the meeting finally ended, people stood more slowly than usual, not because they were unsure, because they were recalibrating. Some nodded as they passed. Subtle, respectful, different from before. Eleanor remained seated longer than the others. When she finally stood, she didn't look at me right away. When she did, there was no hostility in her expression. Just clarity. "You built this quietly," she said. "Yes." A brief pause. "I should have known. That would have required looking." She accepted that. Didn't argue. Didn't defend it. Then she gave a small nod and walked out of the room. No announcement. No attempt to recover authority. Just a decision to step away from something that had already moved beyond her control. Daniel closed his briefcase. "Well executed," he said. "It was always going to be," I replied, "because this wasn't about timing, it was about preparation, and preparation removes uncertainty." We walked out together. The hallway felt different now, not because the building had changed, but because perception had. People looked up as we passed, not out of curiosity, out of awareness. By the time I stepped into the office that had once belonged to Ethan, everything was already being updated. Access, titles, internal systems, fast, efficient. Like the company had been waiting for clarity it didn't know it needed. I set my folder on the desk and looked around the room. Same space, different meaning. Because position isn't defined by where you sit. It's defined by what you control. And control, when built properly, doesn't need to be announced. What happened in that room didn't stay in that room. It couldn't. Decisions at that level don't disappear quietly. They move outward through legal channels, through shareholders, through every layer of the company that depends on stability. Within days, the first wave of consequences started to take shape. Internal communications went out carefully worded, focused on continuity and leadership transition. Most employees didn't know the full story, but they understood enough. Something had changed. And it wasn't temporary. Outside the company, the reaction was more direct. Minority shareholders began asking questions, not about the outcome, but about how it had happened in the first place. How an unratified executive position had been allowed to make decisions affecting senior leadership. How proper review processes had been bypassed. Questions like that don't stay as questions for long. They become actions. Within 6 weeks, a lawsuit was filed against Ethan Caldwell personally. Unauthorized restructuring, governance failure, exposure to financial and reputational risk. The number attached to it was significant. Tens of millions. Not symbolic. Substantial. Because when decisions are made without authority, the cost doesn't disappear. It transfers. Ethan's legal team tried to contain it, limit exposure, reframe the narrative. It didn't work. Documentation doesn't bend, and there was too much of it. Every step he took had been recorded. Every gap in his authority was now visible. And once that kind of clarity exists, there's no room left for interpretation. Eleanor resigned a week after the board meeting. No announcement beyond the formal statement. No attempt to explain or justify. Just a signature on a letter and a quiet exit. Her shares remained. Her influence didn't. Because authority isn't tied to ownership alone. It's tied to trust. And once that's broken, it doesn't return easily. Inside the company, adjustments continued. Positions were reviewed. Responsibilities clarified. Processes reinforced. Not as a reaction, as a correction. People who had been overlooked started moving into roles they had already earned years earlier. Decisions that had been delayed were finally implemented. Not quickly, but properly. One of those decisions was promoting Karen Holt to Director of Operations. She had been doing the work long before the title caught up to her. When I told her, she didn't celebrate. She just nodded once. "About time," she said. She was right. Recognition doesn't create capability. It acknowledges it. The office settled into a new rhythm within a few weeks. Quieter, more focused, less interested in appearances, more aligned with outcomes, the way it should have been all along. From the outside, it looked like a leadership change. From the inside, it felt like a reset. Not dramatic, not loud, just a return to something more stable. Because when structure replaces assumption, everything else starts to fall into place. A week after everything settled, I sat on the back porch and took a call I hadn't missed in years. My son. Same time, same routine. "You sound different," he said. Less distracted. I looked out toward the skyline where Iron Vale stood its light steady against the evening sky. "Maybe I am," I said. We talked about small things. His work, his plans, a game he wanted me to come see. "I'll be there," I told him. And this time, I meant it. After the call, I sat there a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened. Not the meeting, not the vote, but the years before it. Because that's where the real story was. People think power is loud, that it announces itself with titles, decisions, or moments like that boardroom. It doesn't. Power is built quietly, piece by piece, year after year. Until one day when it finally matters, there's nothing left to prove. There was a moment when I could have reacted, argued, or tried to prove my worth, but I chose patience, and that choice changed everything. This story reminded me that real value isn't decided in a meeting room, and respect isn't something you demand in the moment. It's something you build quietly over time. If you were in my position, would you fight back immediately, or would you trust the work you've done to speak when it matters most? Not every victory needs noise. Sometimes staying calm is the strongest move you can make. If this story made you think differently, even for a second, consider leaving a comment or sharing it with someone who might need it. And if you choose to subscribe or like this video, you're not just supporting a channel. You're helping stories like this reach people who may be one decision away from changing their path.